All right, thanking God this time for a better understanding of concepts like loyalty, understanding that loyalty can be great, but it can be super misleading if it comes untethered from things like truth and a familiar concept for us, integrity, understanding that this time through the prophet Obadiah, God is going to give us a look at loyalty through another familiar nation this time, Edom, who Ezekiel has reminded us was disloyal to Israel, not for any good reason, but simply because they were envious of Israel. As Obadiah, a one-chapter book, will begin in verse 1. Actually, let's just take it by sections because once again, I think the ESV has done a pretty good job of breaking up the sections. And so I'm going to follow the 4 sections that they have identified here, where in the first 9 verses, Edom is going to seem to be in a particularly lofty position as Israel is going through days of trouble, thinking that they are above the kinds of trouble that are about to plague Israel. Understanding that, God is going to move forward to talking about the way in which their disloyalty to Israel is going to be ironic, because soon in verses 15 through 18, the entire world is going to come into judgment, and Edom is going to find that they are not all that different from Israel, as God is going to make a distinction saying that Israel might actually be better off because after the judgment of the entire world takes place, even though Israel might have gone into judgment first, they might actually be in a better position after it's all said and done. But backing up, beginning in the first few verses, he is going to say, "Thus says the Lord concerning Edom, rise up against her for battle." That's verse 1. Verse 2 going on to say, he is going to make them small amongst the nations and they shall be despised. However, right now in verse 3, it's going to be clear that the pride of their heart has deceived them, understanding that internally at least, they are questioning, who will bring me down to the ground? God is going to remind them again, if nobody else can, he can, and he will. Saying in verse 5 that if thieves had come upon them, or if grape gatherers under the law had come and basically pulled from their fields, they typically would only take what they needed, leaving them something, not so much with the judgment that is to come. Verse 6 saying that they will be pillaged and their treasures will be sought out. Adding insult to injury in verse 7, all their allies, those who they thought might be at peace with them, are actually going to sell them out, which is going to be an ironic comparison to the way that they treated, as we mentioned, Israel in the day of their calamity, or the way that God is prophesying that they will actually treat Israel once it's exposed, how much Edom actually resents Israel when judgment comes to Israel. But that's all going to come after verse 8 or verses 8 and 9, where he is going to say, as for Edom, in addition, I guess, to their lofty position, their destruction is going to come in a way that neither their wise men in verse 8 nor their mighty men in verse 9 are going to be able to help them and prevent what is on deck. Understanding that verses 10 through 14 are going to describe the problem that God has with them, saying, because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. Saying that on the day Israel was in trouble, he stood aloof, and even worse than standing aloof, as they were themselves raided and I guess pillaged, for lack of a better term. At any rate, they were really destroyed if you see the historical outcome of the prophecies against Israel. Either way, he is going to say that they were more like the strangers that came to pillage than the brother that they should have been to Israel. Understanding that these two nations descended from Jacob and Esau, two blood brothers that grew into two nations that should have had probably better relations than they did over the years. Obadiah, however, is another book that gives us the story, I guess, in a verb tense that can be somewhat confusing, because Obadiah is more or less a contemporary of Elisha, one of the older prophets in sequence, but he is talking in present tense about events that are yet to happen, maybe hundreds or maybe 100 or so years off, understanding that the Bible clearly says the Lord sees the end of a thing from the beginning. And so he is exposing how Edom's true resentment might be exposed or will be exposed once they see Israel actually vulnerable, In a lot of ways, like we said before, similar to what you see out of Job and his three friends, the way in which their hearts seem to have been exposed by finally seeing Job in a position of weakness. Likewise, Esau's true heart towards Israel is going to seem to be exposed once they, down the road, see how vulnerable Israel will become. Back to Obadiah, verses 12 through 14, are cautioning them about rejoicing too much or trying to take too much of an advantage over the misfortune of Israel. Going on in verses 15 through 18, as we mentioned, to say, because judgment is coming to the entire world or upon all the nations, and as they have done in verse 15, it shall be done to them. Understanding that, as we said, Israel actually might come out a little better in this situation, or a lot better. Understanding that in verse 17, he's going to say, but on Mount Zion, even though judgment is coming to the rest of the world, there shall at least be those who escape, and Mount Zion shall be holy. Verse 18, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble, pointing forward to a time when the tables will turn. And it's actually going to suggest that Israel is going to ultimately, as we say, be better off than Esau, because the end of verse 18 is going to say there will be no survivor left to Esau, even though verses 19 through 21 are going to describe the way in which Israel will at least rise to possess that which is left, not only of Esau, but the surrounding nations, including the Philistines and the Canaanites, who, if you recall, were those from whom the people of Israel were originally supposed to inherit the land. All that aside, though, this chapter primarily reminded me of what we mentioned before, the concept of loyalty, understanding that Israel was suffering for its sins. Edom might have been justified in disloyalty to Israel if it were based in a legitimate purpose. However, their resentment of Israel goes back to what we mentioned Ezekiel identifying before, and it was simply basic envy. Flipping that for a minute. Likewise, when they were loyal to their neighbors, it doesn't necessarily say why they preferred loyalty to their neighbors over loyalty to their brothers, but their mere preferences were not enough to keep them from being held accountable to God for their betrayal of Israel. Likewise, is the people of God today. We can have all kinds of preferences, but the fact that he is spending this much time through this many prophets rebuking Edom may remind us of something that we saw in Amos, who likewise devoted the first chapter of his prophecy to a rebuke of Edom. And that is our why, or our motive, can be just as important as our what. And insofar as our what is our loyalty, God willing, we will seek to understand his ways, so that in being loyal to him, and likewise the principles of truth and integrity and love that he has called us to, we can then extend a level of loyalty that will attract his restoration, as opposed to merely attracting his judgment.